Okay, so this is from last year's exam. And we have a secondary school proposed for development at the site of a former landfill in Sheffield. Sports pitches occupy adjacent land. Parents have expressed concerns about the development and their children attending the school. In February of this year, the operator withdrew their bid for it, but plans are still under consultation by the local authority. Phase 1, which was your historic study, identified ground gases, potentially toxic elements, lead, chromium, zinc, and copper. And then we have some health effects associated with them. So lead, highly toxic, but not specifically linked to forms of cancer. I think it's a combination of group 2 and group 3 by IARC. And mostly that's from the precautionary principle, not from direct evidence with specific types of cancer. It's difficult to detect lead exposure, but once lead exposure has happened, you have problems with impaired brain function, memory loss, mood disorders, other mental problems, children being particularly vulnerable because their brains are still developing, and lead interferes with the brain chemistry, which is why it's causing these impairments. Chromium, we've spoken about chromium before. Hexavalent chromium is highly toxic, highly soluble, known carcinogen. Trivalent chromium is an essential dietary nutrient. There is some evidence that suggests stomach acid reduces Chrome 6 to Chrome 3, which means the ingestion pathway may be less harmful than inhalation or skin contact because of the acidification. Low concentrations, zinc and copper, essential nutrients. High concentrations, toxic. Neither linked to specific types of cancer. So here we have a picture of the development, and there's some sports pitches in the background. And there's a link there if you want to read more about the development. So the first question, who's a regulator, what regulatory mechanism? What are potential conflicts between the developer and the regulator? How would soil guideline values be determined to establish if remediation is required? Finally, who are the key stakeholders, and what concerns do you expect them to have with this development?
That'd be 20 marks in total.
Yes, 20. So the way that I write them, each case study is 5 questions. I've condensed it to 4 because the 5th one was a bit off the topic I wanted to stay on. Right. Okay, you're gonna have to keep me on track with this thing, because if I touch it, it could go back to where it was, and that would be disastrous for today. So if I'm off the page, just let me know. And don't be polite, just let me know right away. So first question, who's a regulator? Yeah. Yeah, this one's pretty straightforward, local authority. What's the regulatory mechanism here? Why? Right, no litigation. But why is it voluntary? Okay, so if they want to redevelop it, what's the mechanism?
Planning.
Yeah. So close, but no, it's planning, because there is a proposal for redevelopment. There is a planning application that goes in. So, like before, +2 for the regulator, +3 for regulatory mechanism. Much, much harder question. What are the potential conflicts between the developer and the regulator?
Cost.
Okay. So why is cost problematic?
The developer might have more plans than the regulator and all that.
Okay, so we have a balance between the developer and the regulator. So regulator might be a bit stingy, developer might want to do a bit more, or vice versa.
Yeah.
Okay.
She mentioned something about the receptors and how their children go to school, so the regulator might want them to a higher level of capabilities.
Okay, so you think the regulator might be taking a more conservative approach
Yeah.
because of,
Compared to if it was like a wetland rather.
yeah.
School.
Well, they'd have to,
Yeah.
in some respects, because of who's there. But yeah, there is the opportunity to have that kind of a conflict arise. What else?
Timescale.
Okay. So time scale. So what do you mean?
As in, the developers probably will want to get it done quicker, and the regulators will not going to be as fussed with the time. They just want to make sure it's done properly.
Does everybody agree with that? That the regulator here might want it to go a bit slower?
Well, yeah, because the school might only have like the 6 weeks of the holidays to like get it done with.
Okay.
It could impact their running if it takes longer than that. So they'll,
Okay.
whereas the regulator will want it to, go for its full course, which could most probably be longer than the school have got.
Does it depend on when the local council want the school to be open? Because you've got a certain
Yeah.
time to get that school open.
Yeah.
You want it done by a certain date, and you can then press the developer to get it done by then.
Who's your regulator?
Local council.
Okay. Do you see a conflict here? Okay, good. That's full marks. The rest of this, not so much. The rest will get you about 3 out of 5. You have a big conflict of interest here because your local authority is your regulator, but your local authority is also your developer's boss. So the development itself will go out to private companies, so they'll be bidding for it, they'll be the usual thing, but they report back to the local authority. It's the local authority's land. They're the landowner, so they have ultimate responsibility for any of the potential problems that arise. So there is a pretty serious conflict of interest.
So would it become a different regulator?
There's nothing in the legislation that requires that. I mean, that would be a really good thing in some respects, because there is that underpinning conflict of interest that should automatically default to a national body or somebody that doesn't have a direct stake in it, but there's nothing that requires that. It just stays as is. And that's perhaps one of the flaws within the regulatory system, is that there is no mechanism for dealing with conflict of interest like that. So right now, no, the local authority is both the developer's boss and the developer's overseer. They can recognize that and take steps to make sure that doesn't cause problems, but there's nothing that requires them to. Thank you. My handwriting's getting worse as well, so apologies for that. Yeah, and there's some other nuances here you can get into in terms of potential conflicts and some of the more subtle details, but you do need to be able to spot that there is an inherent conflict of interest between those. Yes.
So can you explain the concept?
Right. So, Environmental Protection Act of 1990 specifically empowers the local authority to be the regulator for contaminated land. So, anything within their boundaries, they're the regulator. The local authority is ultimately the one who runs the schools. They own that land. They're having it redeveloped into a school because they see a need for another school in the area. So they're the landowner. They hire in developers to actually, design, spec, build the school, but it's still their land. So they're the developer's boss. They're also the regulator with respect to contaminated land. So there may be within the local authority pressures to cut corners, to move faster, to perhaps take a different interpretation to the site and its safety because of these two competing interests. And in a perfect world, despite having those two competing interests, the local authority can reconcile the problems and still manage the site. But there is there's no oversight to any of that. There's no default bringing in a national body to take an oversight role. There's nothing in the legislation about that. So the conflict remains, and it's the local authorities' responsibility to both recognize it and deal with it appropriately. But recourse comes from somebody getting ill. So if they get it wrong, 10, 20 years from now, somebody might be ill. As a result, you might have your statistically significant cluster among pupils who are attending the school or workers who are there. So the teachers, the school staff that run the place, the groundskeepers that look after it, you might have illnesses arise with them. And that's when you know you didn't get it right, which is quite a long time from now. And it's equally possible that records about this kind of stuff would disappear. So there's nothing preventing that chain of events right now, apart from good actions by a local authority. Let's move on to the next question, which was how are soil guideline values or health criteria values determined for this site?
Got to know what its end use is.
Yeah, so you need to know end use. End use is a school. So what is that in terms of our land uses? Is it? Is it? Exactly. It's neither. So in CLIA, we have 3 land uses. We have residential, allotments, and commercial. It doesn't fit any of them. So what do we do?
Take the worst.
Not really. Is that protective enough? We talked about toxicology and exposure and getting things wrong. We're dealing with a site that has children, but the way that children come into contact with the contaminants of the site is different from any of these land uses. So what do we do here? Yeah.
I would say to pick residential, so to be like more.
You just said the same thing as everybody else, and I said no.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. No, it's important to say that. You have a reason for picking residential, but that's not the set of conditions here. So what do? There is a procedure here. What is it?
Would it be how you, so when we're dealing with adult female child tolerance levels,
Yeah.
would you go down that route instead.
Okay, and what's the word for what that whole process is? Do you remember? On an exam, that thing where you, and then all the things you said is fine, but what do we call that process? Yeah, it's exposure assessment. So there's two things that go into that. You have exposure assessment, but what precedes exposure assessment is your conceptual site model. So what are your linkages? And then what are your exposure scenarios? So CLIA's compartments of residential, allotment, commercial don't fit here. You go back to the beginning, and you may not use CLIA because CLIA is so compartmentalized like that. You may choose to use a different exposure scenario because CLIA never gets you to children. The most conservative receptor that you have in CLIA is your adult female, either a commercial worker or somebody living on a property or somebody using an allotment. So it's not dealing with children specifically. You might want to go back and do your exposure assessment using Sniffer or using one of the other models where you're specifically focusing on a young child. And so the combination of things that you have to do is conceptual site model, what are your exposure scenarios, and then how do we model them using exposure assessment. So basically, these 2 points are what you need. And it's exactly the same, actually, as with the Avenue site, where you have the nature reserve. That's also exposure assessment modeling, but it's different receptors, because mostly it's your wildlife receptors, and then it's your visitors at the visitor center. So if you have your visitor center in a place that doesn't have as much history of contamination, has fewer contaminants that have already then been remediated, so the likelihood of there being traces left over is much, much smaller. That's a different set of conditions for your exposure assessment than your school, where the whole site used to be a landfill and you're redeveloping on it. So back to basics is going back to modeling. Okay, last question then. Who are your key stakeholders and what concerns do you expect them to have? Yeah. I'm going to write that a little bit differently. So the parents, key stakeholders, your children are minors, but I would still call them stakeholders here. Just because they can't legally consent doesn't mean that they don't have a stake here, but they're the ones who are most likely to be harmed if there's something that goes catastrophically wrong here. Okay, so let's get the stakeholders down and then we'll get into what concerns they have. So who else would be a key stakeholder? Yeah. Yeah, your local authority. Who else? Yeah. So whoever's going to be working there.
See, for all people like school staff, parents and children, if you put receptors, would you still get a mark for that? So they're actually...
No, because there are other potential. So just calling them, just saying receptor, human receptors isn't really specific enough, because as we populate this list, I also want to put other stakeholders on here, the ones who are not key, and hopefully then it'll be a little bit more clear. Who else? Okay, so you first, then you. Okay, developer.
That's pretty much it. The company's hired to do the work, the consultants
Okay.
hired to come in and do all the
Okay, consultants, and who else?
and the construction.
Yeah. Yeah, so you have often, if it's a small developer, you're doing all of these things within the one company. where you have your developer and your construction team all come from the same company. So they do the design spec and build, and then bring in extra support for specific activities as they need. But if it's bigger and more complicated, then they may have separate, or there might be some procurement issues that make it be separate teams. So you have a consultancy do the design, and then either the local authority or the consultants will hire in the contractors, depending on how that subcontracting works.
What about the company that does the remediation process
Yeah.
of the job?
And remediation may follow the same. We have a lot of small remediation businesses that'll do everything, but also larger consultancies that may do the design, and then either the local authority or the consultants will then identify the contractors and subcontract to them to do it. Okay, so that I'm happy with that for the key stakeholders. Who are other stakeholders? So who are the ones that shouldn't be on this list as key stakeholders, but still might be involved somehow?
Local residents in the area?
Okay, yeah, I think we can fit this. Okay, local residents. So what is something that would promote them to this list?
There's contamination found in there.
Yeah, it depends how close they are. So if there's contamination, sure. If they are immediately adjacent to the site, then perhaps as well. So it's not all local residents. It would be the ones immediately around the area might be promoted into the key list, if that's the case. Who else might be somewhat involved here, but not the most important of your
Local
stakeholders?
councillors, politicians.
Yeah. I think that's how you spell councillors. Anybody else? Another one that shows up if there's a stink about something that needs to be made, then media might be involved in that as well, but they'd never be key stakeholders. So in an exam, if you're posed with this kind of question, what I'm happy to see is you make the whole list and then you start to score things off to narrow down to key. But if you just vomit up every potential stakeholder, you're not going to get as many marks as if you narrowed it down a bit. Okay, let's go back to the beginning. And what concerns do you think they're going to have? Obviously, it'll be a lot more nuanced than what we'll note here, but just in general, key points. What do you expect parents and children to be concerned about?
Health and well-being.
Yeah. So is there any likelihood of contaminant exposure that might compromise their health and well-being? Remembering that children are particularly vulnerable to a number of these contaminants. Local authority, you have two different motivations here to sit with it, yeah.
Would the parents and children also be concerned about the conflict of interest? Or
If they've recognised it as such,
then
yes.
something pushed through?
One of the things I've found is that the local public don't necessarily understand the nuances of contaminated land regulation, so they might not even be aware of that. But they would be concerned that the local authority is sort of barreling ahead with development without concern for their well-being. So that is a fair point. So what two concerns, just broadly summarizing the two competing aspects of the local authority? Yeah. The local authority thinks it needs a school. They may have already locked in to that particular site, given how far advanced the plans are. But they are convinced they need a school. Okay, from the regulatory point of view, concerns? That's a good point, and it actually might sit with the developer side of things. Maybe they will take Corby to heart. Anybody have a chance to read the Corby judgment yet? I've linked to it on my place. It's totally worth reading because the developers were essentially the local authority. Developer's not the right word. The remediation team was run by the local authority. They did it so badly, and they're such cowboys about it. So maybe that's an eye opener, but it might not be. Corby's one judgment. Okay, and from the regulatory side of things, so your environmental health officer, your contaminated land officer, what would they be concerned about? Yeah. So it needs to be safe for its proposed use. And the combination of your environmental health and contaminated land teams should be looking out for that. It's a special circumstance around redevelopment because it's risk-based. It's modeling specific exposure scenarios, so they need to be convinced that what's been done is appropriate. School staff, what are their concerns?
Same as parents and children.
Yeah. So their safety is something they'd be concerned about. What else might mitigate that a little bit? Pardon? Yeah, jobs. So don't know what the local employment situation is in the area, but it might be a source of jobs. And if it's a more deprived area, then there might be people willing to put up with more, which sounds a bit patronizing, and I don't mean it that way. But if you have high unemployment and you have a limited number of jobs, you're going to have a lot more applicants for it. Let's do this chronologically. Remediation team, what do you think their concerns are going to be?
Exposure.
Yeah. Anything else? Okay, so remediation done well. Anything else? Why might a remediation team do it badly?
Let's get more work.
Yeah. Same issue pops up here. The cheaper it is, the more take home they have. So there might be some competing interests there. And how about the developer? Anything different from the remediation team?
Cost.
Anything else?
Time.
Yeah, I mean, the faster it's done, the more cost effective it is. And it'll usually be fixed contract, so they'll make more money out of it. So that side of it may be more pronounced. The other thing is they may have less knowledge about contamination because that's not what they do. So if the remediation team doesn't do their job well, then there's more potential exposure for them, but they may not be aware enough of potential problems to know it's a problem. So it may not register as a concern to them, which is why it's so important for the remediation team to do their job well, for the local authority, the regulator oversight, to do their job well, because not all of the parties involved necessarily have that specialist knowledge about contamination. Okay, I think that's a good time for a break. It's 10 o'clock, so we'll pick up at 10 past.